The ruined city stretched under a heavy gray sky. Tall buildings leaned like dying trees. Broken glass and rusted metal covered the ground. The only sounds were the cold wind and the soft crunch of Daniel's boots. He moved carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the wreckage. Daniel was a scavenger. Not by choice, by survival. In this dead world, food, water, and clean cloth were treasures more valuable than gold. His backpack was almost empty. He needed to find something, anything, before nightfall. He passed an old collapsed market, the metal roofs hanging low and dangerous. Then he heard it, a sound that made him stop cold. A cry, soft, weak, like a broken bird struggling to live. Daniel turned toward the noise, heart pounding. No animal cried like that. No machine made such a sound. It was a child. He followed the sound, pushing aside piles of broken crates and rotting cloth. The smell of decay filled the air. Daniel covered his mouth with his sleeve and pressed on. The cry came again, even weaker. He dropped to his knees and ripped through a mound of trash. There, hidden under filthy rags and torn plastics, he found it. A tiny alien baby. Its skin was pale blue, mottled with patches of gray. It was thin, painfully thin, ribs, showing through fragile skin. The baby's eyes fluttered weakly, too exhausted to even cry properly now. Daniel stared in horror. Who would leave a baby here? Who would throw away life like garbage? He lifted the baby gently into his arms. The child was cold, so cold. Daniel pulled off his jacket without thinking and wrapped the tiny body inside, holding it close to his chest for warmth. The baby whimpered once, then went still against him, alive, but only barely. Daniel stood up, scanning the broken streets. Someone had left this baby here. Someone had given up. But why? Movement caught his eye. A figure, thin, stumbling, darted between two fallen walls. Daniel's instincts flared. He shifted the baby carefully in his arms and followed. The figure moved slowly, limping badly. It collapsed once against a broken pillar, then forced itself up again. Daniel kept his distance, not wanting to scare whoever it was. Finally, the figure stumbled into a dark alley and fell hard onto the ground. Daniel approached cautiously. As he got closer, he saw the truth. It was a woman, alien like the baby. Her skin was the same pale blue but darker around her eyes and mouth, signs of hunger and sickness. Her clothes were torn and dirty, barely covering her thin frame. She curled into herself, shivering, her breath shallow. She didn't even look up as Daniel approached. He crouched beside her. "Hey," he said softly. No response. He set the baby down carefully on the cleanest patch of cloth he could find. He touched the woman's shoulder gently. She flinched weakly but didn't move away. Her body was broken by starvation. Her mind seemed lost in despair. Daniel's throat tightened. This woman, this mother, had not abandoned her child because she was cruel. She had abandoned the baby because she had nothing left to give. No food. No strength. No hope. Daniel looked between the mother and the baby, both so close to death, both thrown aside by a world that had stopped caring. He made his decision without thinking, without hesitation. He slipped his arms under the woman's fragile body and lifted her as best he could. She was so light it was like carrying air. Then he picked up the baby, holding both close to his chest. He turned toward the camp, hidden a few miles back in the ruins. It was dangerous to carry so much weight alone. Hunters roamed the dead streets. Storms could rise without warning, but Daniel didn't care. Some things were worth the risk. Some things were worth saving. Step by step, he moved through the wreckage. The woman stirred once in his arms, whispering something in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was full of pain and shame. Daniel didn't need to understand the words. He understood the meaning. She thought she had failed. She thought she deserved nothing. He tightened his grip on her, holding her steady. "You're not alone," he said softly, knowing she probably couldn't hear him. "But you're not trash. Not anymore." The city stretched endlessly before him, but Daniel walked on, never slowing, never hesitating. In his arms he carried two fragile lives, and with every step he made a silent promise. No more abandonment, no more despair. Not while he still had breath left in his body, not while he could still fight. And so, across the ruined streets of a broken world, one human carried hope in his arms. Battered, starving, but still alive. Still fighting. Because that's what humans did. They fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves, even when no one else would. The ruins seemed endless. Daniel's arms ached from carrying the alien woman and her child. Every step over the broken ground felt heavier than the last, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The baby stirred weakly in the bundle against his chest, giving a soft, painful whimper. The woman, cradled carefully in his arms, remained silent, her breathing shallow and uneven. Daniel gritted his teeth and kept moving, forcing his tired body forward. The shelter wasn't much, a crumbling building patched with scrap metal and torn tarps, hidden behind a collapsed highway. But for now, it was home. It had walls. It had a roof that mostly kept the rain out, and most important, it had safety. Daniel pushed open the bent metal door with his shoulder and stumbled inside. The dusty, broken world outside disappeared behind him. He laid the woman down gently on an old sleeping mat. Then he unwrapped the baby from his jacket and checked it carefully. Still alive. Still fighting. Just like the mother. Daniel worked quickly. He lit a small fire in the corner using old, dry wood. He boiled a little water in a cracked pot. He pulled out the last of his supplies, a few pieces of dried meat, a half-full water bottle, and a small pack of powdered food. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But it was all he had. And it would have to be enough for now. The woman stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she looked confused, terrified. She tried to sit up, her body trembling with the effort. Daniel moved quickly, placing a hand on her shoulder, speaking in a calm, low voice. "You're safe," he said. "Rest." She stared at him wide-eyed, clearly not understanding his words. But something in his voice made her stop struggling. Slowly she sank back onto the mat. Her body shook from weakness and fear. Daniel softened his voice further. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I'm here to help." Still no response. But she didn't move away. It was enough. He turned his attention to the baby. The small creature whimpered softly, lips dry and cracked. Daniel crushed a small piece of dried meat into powder, mixed it with water, and carefully fed the baby with a clean piece of cloth twisted into a straw. It wasn't ideal, but the baby sucked weakly at the cloth, drinking precious drops. Daniel sighed in relief. Alive, still fighting. He offered the mother water next, holding the bottle carefully to her lips. At first she refused, turning her head away, shame burning in her sunken eyes. Daniel didn't push. He simply waited. Finally, trembling, she reached for the bottle herself. Her hands shook so badly that Daniel had to steady it for her. She drank in small, desperate sips, like someone afraid the kindness might be ripped away at any second. Daniel's heart broke a little more with each sip. Afterwards, the woman curled onto her side, one hand resting protectively near the baby. Daniel sat back, watching them carefully. He didn't know her story yet, didn't know how long she had been running, didn't know what horrors she had faced. But he knew one thing for sure. She had fought with everything she had left. She had survived when the world wanted her to die. And now somehow she had stumbled into his arms. Daniel wrapped an old blanket around his shoulders and leaned back against the wall. The fire crackled softly, pushing back the cold. The woman and child slept, their breathing slow but steady. He listened to the small, fragile sounds of their life. Each breath a miracle. Each heartbeat a quiet rebellion against a cruel, broken world. Outside, the city roared with distant thunder. Another storm was coming. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling exhaustion pull at him, but he stayed awake. He would not sleep. Not tonight. Not until he was sure they were truly safe. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know how he would feed them or where they would go once the supplies ran out, but those were problems for another day. Tonight he had only one duty: protect them, keep them alive, and somehow give them a reason to believe that life was still worth fighting for. In a world that had forgotten mercy, Daniel chose to remember. He chose to care. He chose to fight, not with guns, not with power, but with stubborn, unshakable kindness, and, in doing so, he lit a small flame against the darkness, a flame called hope. The next morning came slowly. Weak light filtered through the cracks in the shelter's broken roof. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars caught in a dying world. Daniel sat by the dying fire, sharpening a broken knife with slow, careful strokes. His eyes stayed on the sleeping figures across the room, the alien mother and her tiny child. They were still alive, still breathing. And somehow, that felt like a small miracle. The woman stirred first. She blinked slowly, confusion filling her hollow eyes. For a long moment, she didn't move, as if afraid any motion would shatter the fragile safety she had found. Daniel stayed still, giving her space. No sudden movements. No loud words, only patience. Finally, the woman sat up, her body shaking with weakness. She pulled the blanket tighter around her thin shoulders and glanced around nervously. Her eyes locked onto Daniel, a human sitting quietly, watching but not threatening, her hands curled into fists, ready to defend her child if needed. Daniel saw the fear in her eyes and slowly placed his knife down on the ground where she could see it. Far from him, harmless, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small metal cup. He poured clean water into it and set it near her. No words, no pressure, just an offering. The woman stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached out with trembling hands and lifted the cup. She drank carefully, never taking her eyes off Daniel. Trust wasn't built in a moment. It was built in tiny pieces, and Daniel was willing to build it, one small piece at a time. The baby woke next. A soft, broken cry echoed in the small shelter. The woman stiffened, instantly her instincts pulling her toward the child. She scooped the baby into her arms, rocking gently, whispering words Daniel couldn't understand. He smiled slightly at the sight. There was strength there, buried deep, but still burning. He pulled out the last of his dried rations and placed them on a cracked metal plate. Simple food. Nothing special, but life-saving now. He tore a small piece and offered it to the woman. At first, she hesitated. Pride and fear warred inside her. She had been taught that food came with a price. That kindness was a trap. But Daniel waited, patient as stone. Finally, she took the food with shaking hands. She broke it into smaller pieces and fed her baby first, pressing the crumbs into the child's tiny mouth with infinite care. Only when the baby had eaten did she take a small bite herself. Daniel nodded approvingly. Survivors always fed their young first. It was a law older than any civilization. Time passed slowly that day. Daniel worked on strengthening the shelter, fixing gaps in the wall with broken wood and metal sheets. The woman sat near the fire, her child sleeping in her lap, watching him with wary curiosity. Sometimes their eyes met. She would quickly look away. But each time, her gaze lingered a little longer. Each time, the distance between them grew smaller. That evening, When the wind howled outside and the cold crept into the cracks, Daniel added more wood to the fire. He motioned for her to come closer. For a moment, she hesitated, instincts pulling her back. But then, wrapping the blanket tighter around her and the baby, she moved closer to the warmth. She sat just an arm's length away from him, close enough to share the fire, close enough to share safety. Not close enough for touch, not yet, but it was a beginning. Daniel didn't speak much. Words could wound as easily as they could heal. Instead, he let actions speak. He shared the fire. He offered water when needed. He gave her space when she pulled away. He protected the silence when she needed it. Little by little, the walls between them began to crack. Not fall, not yet, but crack. And through those cracks, something precious began to grow. Not trust, not fully, but the first fragile seeds of it. That night, as Daniel leaned against the wall, watching the fire die down, the woman did something that surprised him. She pulled a second, smaller blanket from his pack, one he had offered earlier but she had refused, and gently placed it over him. A silent, "Thank you." A silent promise. Daniel didn't speak. He only smiled into the darkness. In a world where survival made people cold and cruel, two broken souls were finding a new way forward. Not as enemies, not as master and servant, but as something else. Something built from broken pieces, stitched together by kindness, trust, and the stubborn belief that even in the ashes of a dead world, family could still be found. Morning light slipped into the broken shelter, soft and golden. The fire had burned low, leaving only warm ashes. Daniel woke slowly, his body sore from sleeping on the hard ground. He rubbed his eyes and sat up. Across the room, the alien mother sat awake, her child sleeping quietly in her arms. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't curled into a ball like a hunted animal. She simply sat there, tired, thin, but calm. Watching Daniel. Waiting. Daniel smiled softly and stood. He stretched his arms and walked toward the small cooking pot near the fire pit. There wasn't much left to cook, only a few scraps of dried food and some crushed roots he had gathered days ago. Still, he worked quietly, stirring the little stew, letting the smell fill the shelter. The woman watched him, cautious but curious. Not like before. Before, she watched him expecting pain. Now she watched him wondering why he was helping, why he stayed, why he cared. When the simple meal was ready, Daniel divided it into two small bowls. He placed one in front of the woman and sat back, eating from his own. No words, no demands, just a silent offer, a choice. She stared at the bowl for a long time. Then slowly, carefully, she picked it up and brought it to her lips. She ate with small, delicate bites, feeding her child tiny pieces as well. Daniel hid his smile. Behind his bowl, trust wasn't built in one day, but it was growing, bit by bit. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the heat filled the ruined city, Daniel set about repairing the shelter again. The woman watched for a while. Then, surprising him, she shifted the sleeping baby onto a bundle of cloth and got to her feet. She moved, slowly, her body still weak but with determination in every step. She picked up a broken piece of wood and began helping him patch the walls. No words, no orders, just silent understanding, working together, side by side. When Daniel looked at her, she dropped her gaze quickly, shy and uncertain, but he just nodded and smiled, a simple, genuine smile that said thank you. The woman's lips twitched as if she almost smiled back. Almost. That evening, as the sky turned a soft red, Daniel sat outside the shelter, sharpening his knife. The woman sat nearby, cradling her child, humming, a soft, broken tune. Daniel recognized it. Not the song itself, but the feeling behind it. It was a lullaby. A mother's song, something older than language, older than war, older than fear. It was hope, wrapped in sound. He listened quietly, letting the music wrap around him. For the first time in many nights, he didn't feel alone. When the stars appeared, Daniel spoke. His voice was low and careful, like someone trying not to frighten a bird. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman froze for a moment. Then, in a whisper so soft it nearly disappeared in the wind, she answered, "Saela." Daniel repeated it, testing the sound. "Saela." She nodded. A small thing, but important. Names were power. Names were trust, and now he had hers. He pointed to himself. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel," she echoed, her accent strange but beautiful. Another thread woven between them. Another wall fallen. Later, when they sat around the fire, Saela did something that surprised them both. She reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and placed her hand lightly over Daniel's, just for a second. Just a touch, but it was a touch freely given. A touch not demanded, by fear or debt. Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak. He only turned his hand and gently squeezed her fingers before letting go. No promises. No rush. Just understanding. In that ruined city where trust had been murdered 1,000 times, a single spark flickered to life, a bond, fragile and new, but real. They weren't family yet. They weren't safe yet. The world outside still waited with claws and teeth, but inside this small, battered shelter, two broken souls were learning to trust again. Learning to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world didn't have to stay broken forever, and sometimes Daniel thought that was the bravest thing of all. The next few days passed quietly. Daniel, Saela, and the baby built a fragile rhythm inside the ruined shelter. They shared food. They repaired broken walls. They spoke few words, but their actions spoke louder. For the first time in many hard months, Daniel allowed himself a small breath of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a life here. Maybe the world had forgotten them. And that was a good thing. But hope, in this broken world, was dangerous, because it made you believe you were safe. And safety was an illusion. Daniel first noticed something wrong when he returned from a short scavenging trip. The shelter looked the same from a distance. Battered, quiet. But the air felt different. Thicker. Colder. He moved faster, hand resting on the handle of his knife. He pushed open the broken door and froze. Inside, Saela crouched near the fire, her body wrapped tightly around the baby. Her silver eyes were wide with fear. And standing over her, two strangers. They were tall, rough-looking men, with scavenger gear patched together from old armor and scraps. Their faces were hidden under cracked helmets, but Daniel could smell the cruelty on them. Raiders, not slavers, might it worse, men who preyed on the weak simply because they could. One of the raiders noticed Daniel and laughed. "Look what we have here," he said, voice rough and mocking. "A human playing house with a broken alien." The second raider nudged Saela with his boot, making her flinch. "This one's pretty enough," he sneered. "Bet she'll fetch good trade." Daniel's blood went cold. Slowly he stepped inside, careful not to spook them yet. His voice was calm, but his hands were ready. "Walk away," he said. "Now." The raiders laughed. The first one pointed at Daniel with a rusted pistol. "You gonna stop us, little man?" Daniel didn't answer. He moved. In a blur, he grabbed a piece of broken metal from the floor and hurled it across the room. It hit the pistol with a loud clang, knocking it from the raider's hand. Before either man could react, Daniel charged. He slammed into the first raider, driving him hard into the wall. The second lunged for Saela. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Instead, she moved, throwing a handful of hot ashes from the fire straight into the raider's face. The man screamed, clutching his burning eyes. Daniel spun around, grabbing the fallen pistol. He aimed it with steady hands. "Leave," he said again, voice like iron. This time, they believed him. Half blind and bleeding, the raiders staggered out into the wasteland. Daniel slammed the broken door shut behind them. Then he turned to Sayla. She stood still, holding the baby. Tight, her chest heaving with terror. But her eyes, her beautiful bright eyes, burned with something stronger than fear. Fire. Strength. Survival. Daniel crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "You're safe," he said softly. Sayla nodded slowly, tears sliding down her face. Not tears of helplessness, tears of rage, tears of life. That night, as the fire crackled low, Daniel reinforced the shelter as best he could. He placed sharpened sticks and broken glass around the entrance. He kept the pistol close, fully loaded. He sat near the door, ready to fight again if needed. Sayla sat across from him, rocking the baby gently. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They knew. The world outside still hunted them. Still hated them. Still wanted to tear apart what they were building. But they also knew something else. They were not weak. Not anymore. Daniel looked at Sayla, watching her hum a broken lullaby to her child. He saw the scars on her arms, the strength in her hands, the fire in her eyes. She was no one's victim anymore. She was a survivor, a mother, a fighter. And Daniel made a silent vow that night. No matter who came, no matter how strong the enemies were, he would stand. He would fight. He would protect them. Because in this broken world, family wasn't blood. Family was who you bled for. And Daniel was ready to bleed. Again. And again. And again. The sun had barely risen. A cold wind swept through the ruined city, carrying the heavy smell of smoke and old metal. Daniel stood at the entrance of the broken shelter, the pistol heavy in his hand, the rough knife tucked into his belt. Behind him, Sayla sat with the baby, wrapped tight in layers of cloth. Her eyes never left him. She knew what was coming. They both did. Far across the rubble, dust clouds rose. Figures moved through the ruins, armed, angry, hunting. The raiders had returned, and this time, they had brought more. 6, maybe 7. Too many, too well armed. Daniel's stomach twisted with fear. But he didn't run. He didn't even step back. Because running meant leaving Sayla and the baby behind. And that was not an option. He took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the pistol. If they wanted a fight, they would get one, even if it cost him everything. The first shot rang out, striking the metal wall beside him. Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned out, fired once, the old pistol kicking hard in his hand. A raider dropped to the ground, screaming. Panic spread through their ranks. They hadn't expected real resistance. They hadn't expected one man to stand against them. They charged. Daniel fought smart. He stayed low, used the broken walls for cover, fired quick, careful shots. He didn't waste bullets. He didn't waste time. He made every move count. A raider tried to flank him. Daniel dropped the pistol, empty now, and drew his knife. They met in a clash. Of bodies, a dirty, desperate struggle. Daniel fought like a man who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. A headbutt. A punch to the gut. A slash of the knife. The raider fell. Daniel staggered back, blood on his hands, lungs burning. But he didn't fall. He refused. Another raider came at him. Daniel grabbed a broken pipe from the ground and swung it hard. Metal met bone with a sickening crack. The raider crumpled. Shots filled the air. Daniel ducked and rolled, feeling the heat of plasma bolts slicing past him. He threw a rock, not to hit, just to distract. He rushed forward while the raiders flinched. Close, combat, his kind of fight. He fought with everything he had, his fists, his boots, his rage. Not because he thought he could win, but because giving up was not in him. Not when Sayla and her child's lives hung in the balance. Blood blurred his vision. Pain screamed through his ribs. His muscles shook from exhaustion. But still he stood. Still he fought. Finally, the raiders began to break. They hadn't expected this. Not from one man. Not from a human fighting like a wounded wolf guarding its den. They cursed and fell back, dragging their wounded. They vanished into the ruins, swallowed by the dust and the ruins. Gone. For now. Daniel dropped to his knees, gasping for air. The world spun around him. He wiped blood from his eyes and forced himself up. Slowly, painfully, he stumbled back to the shelter. Sayela was waiting. She rushed forward, dropping beside him. Her hands, small, soft, strong, touched. His face, his arms, checking for wounds. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. She was stronger now, stronger because he had believed she could be. Daniel gave her a crooked smile. "Told you," he whispered. "Not leaving." Sayela shook her head, a fierce, proud look on her face. "No," she whispered back. "Family stays." Daniel laughed softly, the sound rough and broken but full of life. "Yeah," he said. "Family stays." That night they didn't sleep. They kept the fire burning high, kept the pistol loaded, kept watching shifts. Because danger wasn't gone forever. But they had won today. And in this broken world, sometimes surviving the day was the greatest victory of all. Daniel leaned back against the cracked wall, watching Sayela hum a soft song to her baby. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the fire, the sounds of life, the simple fact of their survival wash over him. He knew there would be more fights ahead, more pain, more hard choices. But tonight, they had stood, together, and that made them unstoppable. Because true strength wasn't about weapons or numbers, it was about defiance. It was about standing when everything in the world said you should fall. It was about protecting what mattered. Even when you were bleeding, broken, and alone, and Daniel, he had never been more human, more alive, more proud. The night passed slowly. The fire burned low, but it never died. Neither did they. Daniel stayed awake for hours, listening to the wind outside, feeling every ache and cut on his body. But when he looked across the small shelter and saw Sayela holding her baby close, breathing steady, alive and safe, every pain faded. Every scar was worth it. Morning came in a soft gray light. The world outside was still broken. The ruins still stretched to the horizon. But inside the small, battered shelter, something had changed, something powerful, something rare. Hope. Daniel stood at the broken doorway, watching the city slowly wake under the weak sun. He felt Sayela approach behind him, quiet footsteps, careful, strong. She stepped beside him, her baby bundled close against her chest. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply watched the light rise over the ruins. Then Sayela broke the silence. Her voice was soft, but full of new strength. "Where will we go?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly, the wind pulling at his torn jacket. "Wherever we want," he said. She looked at him uncertain. The world was still dangerous, still cruel. But when Daniel met her eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Possibility. A future. Freedom. Daniel turned and crouched in front of the baby. The child, tiny, fragile, full of life, stared at him with wide, curious eyes. Daniel smiled and gently touched the baby's hand. "You're safe," he whispered. "You're family now." Sayela knelt beside him. She reached out, not as a servant, not as someone asking for permission, but as an equal, as family. Together, they wrapped the baby in fresh cloth, packed what little supplies they had, and prepared to leave the only shelter they had known. Not because they had to, because they chose to. Because real life, real living, meant moving forward, even through fear, even through pain. As they stepped out into the broken city, Daniel glanced at Sayela. "Are you ready?" he asked. She tightened the bundle against her chest and nodded. For him, she said, looking at her child. For us. They moved carefully through the ruins. The city stretched endless and dangerous ahead of them, but Daniel no longer saw only broken walls and empty streets. He saw roads waiting to be walked. He saw ruins waiting to be rebuilt. He saw a future, not promised but possible. A future they would forge together. Other survivors watched them pass. A human, an alien woman, and a baby. An impossible trio. A living defiance against a universe that had tried to crush them. Some stared. Some turned away. Some followed at a distance. Hope, like fire, had a way of spreading. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't the only ones dreaming of something better. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel felt Sayela's hand brush against his. Not by accident, not by fear, but by choice. He took her hand gently, their fingers lacing together without a word, and step by step, together they walked forward, into uncertainty, into danger, but also into freedom, into family, into life. Because in a world that had forgotten mercy, one human had remembered. One human had chosen kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, love over fear. And in doing so, he had forged something stronger than blood, stronger than chains, stronger than death. He had forged a family, built not from perfect pieces, but from broken ones, mended with kindness, held together with trust, made unstoppable by love. And in the heart of a ruined world under a rising sun, they proved one simple, powerful truth. Humanity was never about survival alone. It was about lifting others up. It was about fighting for more. It was about never giving up, even when all seemed lost. Daniel, Sayela, and the small child disappeared into the endless horizon, not alone, not anymore, but together. A family forged not by fate, but by choice.